So Khamzat Chimaev is making a lot of noise, and he wants to be the main event for UFC 300. And obviously the person that he wants to contend against would be Dricus du Plessis for that middleweight title. Now, I think the likelihood of Dricus being one half of the 300 main event is probably better than 50%, just because there's so many different directions that they could go with DDP, and it would still be a big fight. You could do the Khamzat fight, you could do a Sean Strickland rematch, or that big fight with Israel Adesanya that everybody kind of wants to see, and that's been teed up with the rivalry and the backstory there. But I want to talk in this video specifically about Khamzat and why he may actually be the guy to contend with DDP at UFC 300. Now, Khamzat, I didn't think was eligible because of Ramadan, but he's made it very clear that he's able. I don't know how he'll adjust his training camp to fit the Ramadan restrictions, but he says he's going to be ready and prepared to fight at 300 if he gets the call. Now, DDP is now the champion. So what does that mean? That means he gets pay-per-view points. 300 is going to be a mega event, and DDP said himself, Khamzat can barely get past a 170 fighter who's on the latter half of his career, coming off an injury on 9 days' notice, so he's an easy fight for me, which kind of makes me think, why not? Why would DDP not jump in there with Chimaev if the pay-per-view points are going to be huge and it's a quote-unquote easy fight for him? So what are your thoughts on a potential Chimaev versus DDP matchup? And then what do you think the likelihood of this actually coming together might be?
Well, I love that matchup, and I think DDP versus Khamzat makes a lot of sense. I think the fans would love it, and it would do really well at the top of the 300 main card. But the thing that really sticks out to me is the fact that everybody is on this wild goose chase to try to figure out who the main event is for UFC 300. And after last weekend, it kind of makes sense that DDP would want to get himself right back in there. Even though his face looked a little beat up, he didn't take that much damage. And like you said, there's a massive payday for a champion if they're if they're on UFC's card, regardless of the main event or not. But I really do think that DDP has a lot of incentive to go in there and take that spot. And with everybody playing process of elimination, basically to determine which direction Dana White's going to go with, right? You've got the stars of old that have all retired, GSP, Ronda Rousey, Nick and Nate Diaz. Like, those guys are probably not going to main event. It kind of has to be a champion. And then you go looking through all of the champions that are out there. The heavyweights, that seems to be a mess right now. I know there's a little bit of talk with them, but then you kind of go through each division and nothing really makes that much sense except for middleweight. Now DDP's the champion, and he's got a few good number one contenders and top opponents that he could go in there with, Israel Adesanya being one. And after he teased the 2027 return and said, of course I'm not doing that, he's kind of gone radio silent, which makes me think that maybe he is gearing up for a fight camp. Then you've got Sean Strickland's rematch. Nobody would bat an eye if they said DDP versus Sean. We're going to run it back to see who the best was, because that was such a competitive fight. But that's not the major news that I feel like Dana has been holding, close to the vest and not exposing to us. And I do feel like Khamzat Chimaev is a massive star. He's got that potential to be not only a world champion, but a mega star for the UFC. He's got the it factor. And with DDP coming off a very big win, the biggest win of his career, now being the world champion, I think a fight between him and Khamzat makes a lot of sense. It would do UFC 300 a lot of justice. And I just think if you look at the landscape of all the other divisions, there's really nothing else that sticks out to me that's as intriguing, that's as high profile, and as big of a fight as Khamzat versus DDP.
Yeah, well, the luxury that DDP has is that any of the three potential opponents would be a mega fight.
Right.
All of them, I would certainly argue that Adesanya and Strickland recently is a top 5 draw in the UFC. Adesanya has been for a long time. Conor is number 1. I'd probably put Izzy at number 2 if you just look over the last 5-year period of time. And Khamzat is certainly on a meteoric rise, and a lot of people like to see him fight, and he always brings some drama and some excitement to the fight. So any way it goes for DDP, if he main events 300, it's going to be a mega fight, no matter who's standing across the cage from him.
Right.
But I want to talk specifically about the fight between him and Khamzat and how that might look, because I think that fight is a lot more competitive than maybe DDP thinks that it is.
Yeah.
Obviously, DDP is a big middleweight, but he did fight at welterweight when he was coming up the ranks before his UFC days. Khamzat was a huge welterweight, and now he's kind of like a normal-sized middleweight, in my opinion, but he's got that really tenacious grappling to make up and fill the gaps for the size disparity there. However, DDP does hit like a freight train, and we saw Khamzat Chimaev put down by Gilbert Burns, who also hits very hard, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But Gilbert Burns is a 155 fighter. So DDP certainly is going to pack a heavier punch than Gilbert Durinho Burns does. So it's really intriguing. I don't know where the fight would actually take place, because on the feet, you would think DDP would probably have the advantage, but there again, Khamzat is very crisp with his boxing. DDP certainly likes to work his submission game, but it's hard to see him submitting Boris Chimaev.
Right.
That seems like almost an impossible feat to do at this point. And Chimaev's wrestling, we know how good he is there. So it'd be very interesting, a 5-round main event between DDP and Chimaev. And if that fight were to get made and the odds came out, I think they would be dead even. I could even see, and this might sound crazy to you, Chimaev being a slight favorite.
I could see that too, and oftentimes the odds makers that are determining who the favorite and the underdog is, they have a good understanding of skills and everything like that, but once they release it to the public, it's into the people's hands,
right?
And it just moves. And if you're a casual and you like to bet on fights, you can sway the money line. And I really think that Khamzat Chimaev has taken over by storm. People know he is a dominant force in the UFC, and I understand that Kamaru Usman going all 15 minutes with him may have looked bad in some people's eyes, but Kamaru Usman, we're talking about one of the best welterweights of all time.
Yeah.
One of the greatest fighters that the UFC's ever seen. And yeah, he's really hard to get out of there in 15 minutes, even if he was only on 9 days' notice. Khamzat Chimaev is still getting his hand raised against the best people in the world. And I know that him versus DDP would make for a very exciting match, because DDP has a very come-forward pressure style. And look, I've said it many times on this channel, and I'll continue to say it. His style is very unorthodox, very weird, and it's not something you would point at and say, hey, this is my group of students here, study what this guy's doing and try to do it exactly like that. Because honestly, it's not the prettiest technique in the world, but it works for him. And he's got crazy timing, he's got weird angles, and his pressure makes him very hard to deal with. And on top of that, he showed us his wrestling's very impressive too against Sean Strickland. And while I don't think that he'd be able to go out there and take Khamzat Chimaev down at will like he did Sean Strickland, I think you have some pretty interesting grappling situations, some very interesting situations that could happen against the cage between both men, because both of them are so tenacious, both of them are pressure forward fighters, and one of them would have to take the back step. One of them would have to concede a little bit of space in the octagon. And I think there's a lot of reasons to make this fight for out of the octagon purposes, but for inside the octagon purposes, the fans will be getting their money's worth, especially for a major fight like UFC 300. DDP is an exciting fighter. He might have some crazy styles that we don't see, every day out of our top champions and out of our top fighters. And Khamzat Chimaev is an undeniable force. He's one of the best. He's one of the fastest rising stars on the planet. And I just think that those two guys, inside and outside the octagon, would be able to really get the fans behind it, would be able to promote it well, and be able to deliver on fight night, which is what is most important. You got to get in the cage, and you got to actually, perform for everybody.
Sure, you're 100% right. And here's the thing. If you have a huge star like Khamzat Chimaev who's begging to be on a specific card, and that specific card happens to be the biggest card that you've done in the last 7 or 8 years, at least as far as anticipation from Dana White, the way he's built this thing up and said this card's going to be sick, this card's going to be insane. Why not put one of your biggest stars who's able and ready, who's asking to fight on that card, on the card? And then you look at Chimaev. Well, we know what our co-main event's going to be. Mm-hmm. That's going to be Gaethje versus Max Holloway, or it's going to be the women's strawweight, title fight. Either way, it's going to be. There's two co-main events as far as I'm concerned. Two other belts on the line. So would you put Chimaev before them? Probably not if you have a 185 champion that makes a lot of sense to bring him in. He's got some star power. He's got a lot of fans that are from a part of the world that was not the biggest UFC fan base prior to Dricus du Plessis becoming the champion. South Africa has shown out in a way that even surprised me. I'm pretty blown away even when we post videos on DDP to read the comments and see what type of fan base this guy actually has. It's massive.
He was like an unknown treasure to the world that South Africa knew full well was going to be a treasure to the world.
Yes, he was the hidden gem for sure. And so why not put him on the top of the bill? Listen, I think Israel Adesanya and Sean Strickland both lay claim to having priority over Khamzat Chimaev. Israel Adesanya for his body of work and just the sheer professionalism that he demonstrated in the activity of defending his belt when he was a champion. And then Sean Strickland with the closeness of that fight with DDP and the split decision nature and the controversy that followed. That certainly puts those two guys as far as a quote-unquote who is more deserving argument ahead of Khamzat Chimaev.
Right.
But if Izzy says, look, I need more time, I don't want to commit to 300, I don't know exactly when I'm coming back, okay, he's off the table. Let's look at Sean. Sean, are you ready? Do you want to jump back in there with DDP in April, or do you have something else in mind? If Sean's like, look, I'm good for now. I do want to take on DDP again, but I want to take some time and see what's next. I won the belt, and then I had to turn around and immediately defend it, and then I would have to get immediately back into another fight camp if I were to sign to fight DDP at 300. I just want to chill for a minute. Then that would put Khamzat's name right at the top of that list. And listen, either way you make the fight, I would love to see it. I think it would be a great main event for UFC 300. And Chimaev versus DDP, even if Borz is not the most deserving person on the UFC's middleweight roster for the fight, it certainly is a fight that you could sign me up for, and it would have that big fight feel that you're looking for out of a UFC 300 main event.
100%. And we always want parity. That's why fresh blood is really good. And I know DDP just got the belt, and Israel Adesanya would be a mega fight. But sometimes throwing something unexpected at the crowd is exactly what you need. And Khamzat Chimaev has been a guy that's a top contender and could step in on a main event or a title fight at any notice. It doesn't really matter. Everybody knows he's got the skills to compete with the best in the world. Israel Adesanya needs no explanation. Nobody has to make a case.
Vouch for Izzy.
Nobody has to make a case for Izzy to get a title shot. He deserves it, and he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to lift a painted fingernail if he doesn't want to. But Sean Strickland versus DDP just happened, and I think, though the fight was very competitive, and in my opinion, the most reputable judge in the entire industry, Sal D'Amato, scored it for Sean Strickland. That should speak volumes. But Dana White's talking about how this is going to be a mega thing. This is going to be an event for the ages. And since we just saw this, it does sort of steal some of the thunder. We saw how this story ended, and even though it's controversial, we did just see this fight take place. So I don't really know if that's the big news they're going to try to break for us. Izzy coming back would be big news, but at the same time, we kind of expect that as well. So Khamzat Chimaev is the only one where we don't really expect it.
The curveball is what's going to get us.
Exactly. And I just want to make one more quick point about the UFC 300 event that's coming up and any of the century events that we've seen before. They're so important for the sport. They really get to show the public where the UFC's come from and where they're headed. But most importantly, they represent where we are right now. And I really feel like UFC 300 has a great opportunity to show the world just how far this sport has grown and how far it is reaching all over the world. I mean, there's not a corner of this universe now that isn't being represented in the UFC in some way or fashion. And the fact that it's falling on Ramadan this year does sort of eliminate a large portion of the modern day MMA and UFC landscape. I mean, the guys out of Team Khabib, the guys out of Dagestan, the guys out of some of these areas in Russia, and even some Muslim fighters that don't come from that part of the world aren't really going to be able to represent their culture, represent their people, represent their religion because UFC 300 is falling in Ramadan and that's against their religion. So I think it's really cool that Khamzat Chimaev has sort of gotten the blessing and is in good graces to be a representative for them. And just the fact that he would be able to potentially be a main event fighter on UFC 300 during Ramadan as a Muslim fighter would be very cool. Now, I know it would be very difficult for him to try to balance Ramadan and a fight camp, and also it being UFC 300 makes it about as big of a deal as possible. But I think if there's anybody that can do it, it would be Khamzat Chimaev.
Yeah, that's a solid point.